So a question here from Jeremy. Would you please repeat what the reps and recovery periods were for the downward pyramid you described at the start of the presentation? Because he missed it, unfortunately.
Okay. He's obviously talking about the one I said we did on the 4th of May. You start off with 1,000 minutes recovery, 800 off 2.5 minutes, 600 off 2 minutes, 400 off 90, and the 200 as long as you need before you go for your warm down. So basically, you're starting off with 3 minutes and reducing it 30 seconds each for each effort.
A question from Richard. How often do you do hurdle drills and plyometrics? And he adds to that, I tend to do this every session, if only for 5 minutes or so.
Again, it's if my own running career finished when I was in my 40s. I'm now 66, so 26 years ago when effectively I stopped competing. I used to be coached by the great Frank Horwell, and those kind of things were, not really used at all. So it's not something that's in my area of expertise. However, at the club we do have a coach that is much more an 800 metre based coach. He tends not to coach anything above 800 metres, so he's 400 and 400 hurdlers and 800 metre runners within his squad. And I'll quite often get him to show my athletes how to do those sets of drills, and then whether they keep them in or not, again, I leave up to them depending on how they feel they're benefiting. It's this dynamic stretching issue that, it's a difference between when I was a youngster training. Dynamic stretching was virtually non-existent. Everything we did was static stretching. And I had my athletes, I watched them doing their drills, and then, at some point when there's not too much other pressure, I'll ask them to do some static stretching, and invariably I'm appalled that their ability to touch their toes, for instance, or any other number of movements isn't there. They don't have that flexibility. So I'm still an advocate of a certain amount of static stretching as well as the dynamic stuff.
Good. Anything else you want to add there, Mark?
I would say that when you mention the word hurdle drills, that's like all plyometrics. It's a whole book in itself. Hurdle drills, I would use mini hurdles with 4 to 5 pigeon feet apart, 10 of them, with accelerated runs through them. Now, those are hurdle drills. They actually exaggerate the float land phase of a hurdle, allows the coach to watch, looks at flexibility. Hurdle drills for endurance, whereby you're getting athletes to actually walk over full-size hurdles. It has its place. Definitely, it is event specific. You do need to have somebody who knows what they're doing. Where would you fit it in? I would fit it in, as Pete alluded to, into the drill format. Plyometrics is somewhere where I go to with an athlete that has developed, as we alluded to earlier, the fundamental movement skill. Without fundamental movement skill, you can't introduce plyometrics. And by the way, running is a plyometric movement in itself. So where do you go with plyometrics? I'll teach you to skip. Skip, I can't say it. Help me. Skip stiffly. Yeah, with the 4-foot landing, and skip then produce to skipping your drills, and then we're talking about jumping and landing. But I digress. But yes, there you are. You can fit it in.
So a question here from Mark Thomas. For all the sessions you listed at the start, how fast are these ran? Is it as a percentage of the race pace or maximum heart rate, or is it working to sort of an RPE 7, 8, 9, 10 out of 10 effort kind of stuff? So I guess he's looking for the format of either how fast you run then.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the 1,000 meter effort, if an athlete is able to run 3 minutes at 72 seconds a lap, I would expect the 800 to be faster, not slower, 600 to be faster still. and it's striking that balance that the session is progressively getting faster. If you were to look at the heart rate data, you would expect the last fifth of each effort to be going well above threshold, because the rest period is designed to enable that the physical the body to physically reduce the amount of lactic that's gone in from the so typically if you had an athlete that was running 3 minutes for the 1,000, I would expect something 222, 220 for 800, something like 152 for 600, 64 or less for 400, and probably 28, 29 for the 200.
Yeah, so it's safe to say really that you're working towards a desired sort of percentage of your race pace. You've got an idea in your mind that I want athlete X to cover this roughly race pace, or a little bit faster, or just a little bit under, I guess. Yeah. Okay. I was going to say, experience tells you that, you know, if you've got, as I have, 10 athletes doing that session, every 2 or 3 weeks, you begin to be able to say, somebody who cracks the 1,000 out in 248, 250, is and continues to make the same kind of progress right the way through the rest of the session. Mm-hmm. They haven't just blown themselves up in the 1,000. That's an athlete that's destined to run something 1,500 in the 350s. If they start the 1,000 off running in sub 240, that's an athlete that's capable of running 1,500 in the 340s rather than the 350s. No, that makes absolute sense with that. And I guess it's all about the maturity of the athletes on the athlete-coach relationship. So an inexperienced athlete, you probably are going to work more towards, I'm giving you a prescribed percentage of your heart rate or a rate of perceived effort. As you and the athlete become more skilled at doing these, then you can, like you say, quite easily extrapolate what I want you to cover that at. That makes sense. Question
Absolutely,
from...
but you can't tell an athlete, I want you to be running this percentage of your heart rate, because in 1,000 meters they'll spend their time looking at the watch and not concentrating on what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah,
you can only have that conversation after the session's finished.
Yeah, that is indeed the challenge. I'm thinking around my mind is, you don't want the athlete constantly every few strides checking backwards there, because that's not really going to be very helpful to them. But absolutely, maybe it's something you can look at the data afterwards. As you said, once they're finished, you can analyze the data and say, actually, we hit that percentage, so that's what we're kind of feeling like. Good. Okay, a question from Sylvia. Do you encourage cross training for your athletes?
Yes. I don't. As a guy that dabbled as a youngster with cycling and running, and I didn't feel the two mixed together very well. So I'm absolutely amazed that 1 or 2 of the triathletes that I coach don't seem to have that difficulty. But it may be their physical makeup. I'm not sure what the cause is. However, cross training always features if I've got an athlete that's picking up a niggle or is getting calf sore, or any other reason why I would want to reduce the running that they're doing. I'd encourage to go on the bike or swim, particularly go on the bike, but swimming would do equally as well if they're a competent swimmer.
For sure, definitely. A question here from Eva. I may have to listen carefully to this one because it's a longish question. How do you monitor overtraining and other lifestyle factors that lead to energy deficiency, particularly in young female athletes before periods start? And just talking in terms of preventing early onset of Red S. Do you change training volume intensity for female athletes once periods start?
Typically, I don't reduce it. Unless I felt they were overtraining beforehand. The reality is, if they're overtraining, then the menstrual cycle won't start. There are a number of factors that have to be in place for the menstrual cycle to start. and the one that I always am absolutely adamant about. I've never yet coached a female athlete that started the menstrual cycle if they haven't got a body fat percentage of 17%. Now, the only reason I know that is because I've made it a personal ambition of mine to find out what the factors were. So when we went in to do some sports science testing, which is how I always couched it, disguised it, if you like, they thought they were going into to show me what they could do on the treadmill. And in reality, I was much more interested in what their body fat percentage was. 17% appears to be the trigger for the menstrual cycle to start. Equally, once it started, then the 17% needs to remain, and it's very important that you and the athlete have an understanding that you can't expect an athlete to perform at their absolute best in the first 2 days of their menstrual cycle. Third or fourth day, actually, is when the majority of women's world records are set. And any time in that next week is when they're going to be at their peak capability. And that's because of the distribution of male and female hormones within their bloodstream. After that, it's gradually slowing down. But it's not an excessive, positive or an excessive negative, because these things tend to settle down to eventually when you've got a female athlete that's gone through an erratic menstrual cycle, and eventually it settles down and they become a regular 28-day person. Then from that point on, it's usually very hard in a successful athlete for me to know when the menstrual cycle is without asking. But usually, if they have a complete bum race, and you ask the question, that's invariably the cause. Probably 50% of the time in female athletes.
Yeah, excellent. It's a very complex subject, isn't it, really? But I think you've got some really interesting points there, particularly around sort of monitoring that sort of percentage of body fat, and I guess helping them have those discussions with them helps them to realise that they need to maintain that, because it's quite an important part of their, and like you said, the added bonus that they get when they get the extra hormones during those sort of peak times, which is the ideal time to find your race, really. So it's quite an interesting conversation. An extension really from Ava here on there as well. In terms of mixed, how mixed in terms of target race distance are your training groups, i.e. mainly 800 and 1500 runners and a couple of long distance endurance, or is it very mixed?
My group currently has a guy that can run 148 for 800. Another guy that can run 346 for 1500. And at the other extreme, I've got a guy who can run 49 minutes for 10 miles. So it's a very even spread. I 1500 meter type runners than I do the longer distance guys. Although particularly amongst the veteran ranks, I coach an awful lot of people whose focus is 10 miles plus. So, yeah, I don't deliberately set out to seek a particular type of runner. Whoever asked me to coach them, I'll do my best to, work to their particular needs. But I have to say my specialism tends not to be at the 800 end of the scale. My specialism tends to be the 1500, 3000, 5000. But my knowledge extends to up to the marathon. I coach somebody who's run 2:16 for the marathon. To at the other end, I've coached an older lady in her 80s who's run under 4 hours for the marathon.
I think it's an interesting point to sort of observe. I think for many coaches that are maybe working in a club environment, they're probably going to have a very varied cohort on the track at any one time, with probably a few of the shorter endurance events mixed with quite a few of the longer endurance ones. And I guess if you're doing that, my overriding thought would be to try and have those on the longer spectrum to maybe doing slightly different sessions to those on the shorter spectrum, because you want them to get the best bang for the buck for their time.
Couldn't agree more.
So you might have a separate individual group. So you might have your 800, 1500 meters on earlier on, and then a later track session for those people longer distance.
Or you can do, if it's time managed, because all these things are time managed. Athletes tend to be, what's the termination? Talent rich and time poor. They can only get to you between 6:30 and 7:30. So with my own personal volunteer group, we just divide it into 3 subsections. They appear as one group, but there's a junior group within that, there's a longer distance group within that, and there's an 8:15 distance. But we do actually train together. They work off each other, but it works. So you're not just throwing out a generic set.
Yeah, I have exactly the same. And if I have got a guy training for the marathon at the minute, and sometimes he will do a 4 or 5 mile warm up. He'll do a 4 or 5 mile warm down after the session, and we'll add, maybe half as much again to the session itself, to give him the background that he needs.